In January 1999, inside a bankruptcy court in Tucson, Arizona, one of the most violent and familiar sounds in American manufacturing was finally silenced. McCulloch Motors Corporation, the company that had once dominated the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the backyards of American suburbia, filed for Chapter 11, its assets carved up and its name sold off to foreign holding companies. 50 years earlier, this same brand had revolutionized the timber industry with a Model 325, the lightweight chainsaw that allowed one man to do the work of two. A decade after that, its screaming MC-10 engines ruled the American go-kart craze. But by the late 1990s, the company was drowning. Loggers lost a trusted yellow block. Hardware dealers lost a reliable American supplier. The paradox is that McCulloch did not fail because its machines lacked strength. It failed because its greatest advantage, raw, high-revving, unregulated two-stroke power, had become a massive legal and financial liability under tightening emissions rules. But the real story of McCulloch is not only the story of a 1999 bankruptcy, it is the story of how an American two-stroke engine taught the country what power sounded like and what happened when the market could no longer tolerate the noise. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, just before a pivotal move to Los Angeles in 1946. Before 1949, the American timber industry operated at the speed of human muscle and heavy iron. In the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest and the logging camps of the upper Midwest, cutting down a tree was an agonizingly physical process. The earliest gasoline-powered chainsaws were not tools a homeowner threw into the back of a pickup truck. They were massive, brutal pieces of industrial machinery. A typical logging saw in the 1930s and early 1940s weighed anywhere from 80 to over 100 pounds. It required two men to operate, one man to control the heavy engine block, and another man on the opposite end, holding the stinger handle to guide the massive cutting bar through the wood. The block, the main engine structure that holds the cylinders and major internal parts, was usually cast from iron or heavy steel. These engines were powerful, but they were exhausting to carry through dense brush, steep ravines, and muddy hillsides. If a single farmer in Ohio or a rancher in Texas needed to clear a fallen oak from a fence line, a gasoline chainsaw was simply out of the question. They relied on axes or two-man crosscut handsaws. The American market desperately needed a machine that possessed the violent cutting power of a logging saw, but the physical footprint of a portable hand tool. The man who would solve this problem was not a lumberjack. He was a wealthy, speed-obsessed engineer from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, named Robert Paxton McCulloch. Born into a family that had made a fortune in public utilities, McCulloch used his inheritance to fund a mechanical obsession. In the 1930s, he founded McCulloch Engineering Company in Milwaukee, focusing on performance parts for early automotive hot rods. His primary product was a supercharger, a mechanically driven device that forces more air into the engine, allowing it to burn more fuel and make more horsepower. His superchargers became legendary among early Ford flathead V8 racers. But McCulloch was restless. By 1943, he sold his first company to Borg Warner for a massive profit and immediately started a new venture, McCulloch Aviation. As World War II drew to a close, he realized that the future of lightweight manufacturing was not in the Midwest, but in the booming aerospace corridors of Southern California. In 1946, he packed up his operation, moved his engineers across the country, and opened a new factory in Los Angeles, directly across from what is now Los Angeles International Airport. The move to California was the first major turning point. Los Angeles was overflowing with surplus aluminum, magnesium, and the highly skilled machinists who had just spent the war building aircraft. McCulloch initially secured a government contract to build small, lightweight gasoline engines for military target drones. These drone engines had to meet a ruthless engineering standard. They had to produce massive RPMs. They had to be highly reliable in the air, and above all, they had to be incredibly light. While testing these screaming little drone engines, McCulloch and his engineers realized they were holding the solution to the American logging problem. If they could adapt this high-revving, lightweight aircraft engine technology into a handheld tool, they could eliminate the two-man chainsaw entirely. The engineering challenge was immense. A chainsaw cannot simply be a miniaturized car engine. A logger needs to turn a chainsaw sideways to fell a tree and then turn it vertical to buck the logs. A traditional gravity-fed carburetor, a device that mixes fuel and air before the mixture enters the engine, would flood or starve the engine if turned upside down. McCulloch's engineers utilized a diaphragm carburetor, which relied on engine vacuum and a flexible rubber membrane to pump fuel in any position. But the real breakthrough was in the metallurgy. To make the engine light enough for one man to carry all day, McCulloch heavily invested in die-cast magnesium. Magnesium is a third lighter than aluminum, but notoriously difficult and dangerous to cast. The Los Angeles factory was outfitted with custom high-pressure die-casting machines, allowing McCulloch to mass-produce magnesium engine cases with incredible precision. The first attempt, the Model 549, proved the concept worked, but it was in 1949 that the company permanently altered the American landscape. McCulloch introduced the Model 325. The numbers in its name were a direct promise to the consumer: 3 horsepower, 25 pounds. For the first time in history, an incredibly powerful, gasoline-driven saw weighed less than a sack of dog food. A single man could carry it into the woods, start it with a pull cord, fell a massive pine, and walk out without needing a crew. The Model 325 featured a lightweight magnesium block, a sleek, yellow-painted exterior, and a high-speed cutting chain that tore through hardwood faster than the heavy two-man saws of the previous decade. The reception was explosive. In the Pacific Northwest, professional loggers abandoned their heavy, 100-pound rigs for the lightweight yellow saws. But the true impact of the 325 was far wider. Because it was light, maneuverable, and relatively affordable, the chainsaw was suddenly no longer restricted to professional lumberjacks. A dairy farmer in Wisconsin could buy one to manage his woodlot. A municipal road crew in Pennsylvania could keep one in the back of a truck to clear storm debris. A hardware store in rural Georgia could display one in the front window. McCulloch had taken a specialized industrial machine and turned it into an accessible mass-market engine. The Los Angeles factory ramped up production to meet a demand that seemed to have no ceiling. By the early 1950s, the name McCulloch was becoming synonymous with the screaming sound of a high-revving saw echoing through the trees. The engine was light enough to carry, but what McCulloch needed next was an engine that could conquer every garage, farm, and backyard in America. The secret to McCulloch's sudden dominance was not just the use of lightweight magnesium, it was the absolute mastery of the two-stroke engine. A two-stroke engine, an engine that completes a power cycle in just 2 piston strokes, firing every single time the piston reaches the top of the cylinder, makes incredible power for its physical size, but comes with inherent trade-offs in efficiency and lubrication. Because it does not have a separate oil pan like a car engine, the internal moving parts must be lubricated by oil mixed directly into the fuel. In the 1950s American landscape, the two-stroke was not just a mechanical layout. It was a distinct physical ritual. It meant a homeowner or a logger standing by the tailgate of a truck with a red metal gas can, carefully measuring a heavy dose of oil into a gallon of gasoline, shaking it vigorously, and pouring the blue-tinged mixture into a small tank. When the engine fired, it produced a sharp, violent bark and a trailing cloud of blue smoke. For a chainsaw, the two-stroke was the only logical choice. A 4-stroke engine, an engine that completes intake, compression, power, and exhaust strokes across 4 distinct piston movements, was simply too heavy, too complex, and too dependent on a gravity-fed oil sump that would fail the moment a logger turned the saw sideways. McCulloch engineers refined their two-stroke designs to produce maximum power with absolute minimum weight. Throughout the 1950s, the Los Angeles factory expanded rapidly. McCulloch introduced the Model 33, the Super 33, and the Model 47. They built a sprawling, highly efficient dealer network. A McCulloch chainsaw was no longer a specialty item ordered through industrial logging catalogs. It was sold at the local hardware store in rural Ohio, the farm implement dealer in Iowa, and the outdoor power equipment shop in suburban New York. The bright yellow engine blocks became a familiar sight on store shelves right next to axes, rakes, and hand tools. But just as McCulloch was locking down the American timber and farm markets, a completely unexpected cultural phenomenon handed the company its greatest technological breakthrough. It started in 1956 when a Southern California fabricator named Art Ingalls welded together a small framework of steel tubing, attached four small wheels, and bolted a surplus West Bend lawnmower engine behind the seat. It was the first go-kart. Within 2 years, karting exploded from a backyard hobby into a nationwide obsession. Across America, kids and adults were laying out tracks in empty supermarket parking lots, dirt fields, and small-town streets. There was only one problem. The engines powering these early karts were agricultural. They were designed to spin rotary mower blades at a steady, governed speed. They were heavy, slow, and completely unsuited for the stress of a long straightaway. Kart racers, desperate for speed, started looking for a lightweight engine that could rev high and survive. They found their answer in the woods. Enterprising mechanics began buying McCulloch chainsaws, removing the cutting bars, stripping away the handles, and bolting the raw, high-revving yellow power plants directly to their kart chassis. The results were terrifying and exhilarating. The chainsaw engines, designed to chew through solid oak, turned the small karts into rockets. McCulloch's executives in Los Angeles noticed the sudden spike in replacement engine sales and quickly realized what was happening. Instead of ignoring the racers, McCulloch leaned in. In 1959, the company shocked the market by releasing an engine designed specifically for kart racing, the McCulloch MC-10. The MC-10 was a masterpiece of specialized American manufacturing. It had a displacement, the total volume swept by the piston inside the cylinder, of just 5.8 cubic inches. It was incredibly small, yet it was engineered to survive mechanical extremes that would destroy a normal utility engine. A typical lawnmower engine of the era struggled to reach 3,600 RPM. The McCulloch MC-10 could scream past 8,000 RPM. To survive that kind of violence, the internal metallurgy had to be flawless. The piston, the moving part inside a cylinder that is pushed down by combustion pressure, was subjected to massive heat and friction. The connecting rod, the part that links the piston to the crankshaft, had to endure thousands of directional changes every minute without snapping. The crankshaft itself, the rotating shaft that turns that violent piston motion into rotational power for the wheels, rode on high-quality needle bearings to reduce friction at terrifying speeds. In an American parking lot on a Sunday afternoon in 1960, the MC-10 was a sensory assault. It was the deafening, angry swarm of 20 McCulloch engines waiting for the green flag. It was the distinct, sweet smell of castor oil burning through open exhausts. It was the extreme vibration transferring through a thin steel steering wheel into the hands of a driver. McCulloch had effectively democratized speed. For a few $100s, a working-class teenager in the Midwest could buy an American racing engine, bolt it to a frame, and experience the kind of power-to-weight ratio usually reserved for professional race cars. The MC-10 and the legendary MC Series engines that followed made McCulloch the undisputed king of grassroots motorsport. Kart shops opened up alongside traditional mower shops, carrying display cases full of McCulloch racing pistons, specialized carburetors, and tuned exhaust pipes. The brand gained an aura of danger, speed, and mechanical invincibility. By the early 1960s, McCulloch Motors Corporation was no longer just a company that made logging equipment. It was a massive industrial empire built on the aggressive, high RPM capabilities of the two-stroke engine. They had conquered the deep woods, the suburban hardware stores, and the asphalt tracks of America. The engine had proved it could cut timber and win races. Now the company was ready to cast its yellow blocks by the millions. By 1965, the American landscape was fully awake to the sound of the two-stroke engine. McCulloch Motors Corporation had grown from a specialized toolmaker into a sprawling industrial empire. The Los Angeles factory complex on Century Boulevard, located directly under the flight paths of the expanding international airport, was running at a blistering pace. It was not just an assembly plant, it was a highly integrated manufacturing fortress. Inside, custom high-pressure die casting machines injected molten magnesium into molds 24 hours a day, forming the lightweight engine blocks that were the foundation of the company's wealth. Machining lines milled the cylinder heads and balanced the crankshafts. Thousands of skilled American factory workers turned raw metal into screaming power plants. That year, McCulloch released the machine that would permanently cement its legacy in the American garage, the Mac 1010. The Mac 1010 was a masterclass in aggressive, lightweight engineering. With a displacement of 3.3 cubic inches, roughly 54 cubic centimeters, the engine was housed in a compact, bright yellow magnesium and aluminum chassis. It weighed just over 10 pounds without the cutting bar and chain, yet it produced the kind of violent, high RPM torque that could drop a heavy oak tree in minutes. It featured a fully integrated automatic oiling system to keep the chain lubricated under heavy friction, and a highly refined diaphragm carburetor that never faltered, even when the saw was turned entirely upside down. But the true genius of the Mac 1010 was not merely its internal mechanics, it was its price, its reliability, and its placement in the retail market. McCulloch marketed the saw directly to the American homeowner, the farmer, and the suburbanite. A man did not need to be a professional lumberjack in the Pacific Northwest to justify owning one. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the bright yellow Mac 1010 became a staple of the American machine shed. In an America where an engine could decide whether a field was cleared before winter, a rural road was opened after a storm, or a weekend racer won on dirt, power was not an abstraction. It was iron, magnesium, fuel, heat, sound, repair, and trust. The ritual of the McCulloch chainsaw became deeply ingrained in the American weekend. It meant standing in a driveway, mixing exactly a half pint of two-cycle oil into a gallon of gasoline. It meant pulling the choke, yanking the stiff pull cord, and feeling the sudden, angry vibration of the engine springing to life in your hands. It meant the unmistakable smell of blue exhaust smoke drifting across a suburban lawn or a Midwest woodlot. The engine did not purr, it barked. It was a loud, unapologetic mechanical voice that signaled work was being done. Surviving company materials and trade press accounts suggest that during this era, McCulloch was manufacturing over 1 million engines annually. The yellow power plants were no longer restricted to chainsaws and go-karts. The company adapted its core two-stroke blocks to run portable generators, earth drills, brush cutters, and high-volume water pumps for agricultural use. Simultaneously, the company maintained a highly lucrative relationship with the United States military. The Los Angeles factory continued to build the sophisticated, four-cylinder, two-stroke drone engines used in aerial target practice. This government money provided a massive, steady baseline of cash, allowing Robert McCulloch to dream far beyond hand tools. He funded the development of the McCulloch J-2 gyroplane, attempting to build a small, affordable rotorcraft that he believed would eventually replace the American family car. The McCulloch dealer network expanded to over 8,000 locations across the United States. A customer could walk into a dedicated farm equipment dealer, a Sears catalog center, or a local hardware store from Oregon to Maine, and find a wall of yellow chainsaws. Just as importantly, they could buy a spark plug, a replacement air filter, or a carburetor rebuild kit on the same day. The service network was absolute. Mechanics understood the engines, parts were plentiful, and the blocks were durable enough to be rebuilt repeatedly. The brand had become synonymous with rugged, accessible power. The factory was operating at peak efficiency, the dealer network was fiercely loyal, and the two-stroke engine had proven it could dominate both the professional timber industry and the consumer retail market. The company was generating unprecedented amounts of cash, but that overwhelming financial success was about to trigger a fatal distraction. The men at the top of the empire were preparing to look away from the foundries of Los Angeles and toward the empty deserts of Arizona. By the late 1960s, Robert Paxton McCulloch was not just an engine builder. He was a millionaire industrialist with an appetite for massive, unconventional projects. The incredible profits generated by the screaming two-stroke engines on American lawns and logging camps gave him the capital to pursue a completely different vision. In 1963, flying over the desert along the Colorado River, he spotted a massive tract of land. He bought it and founded Lake Havasu City, Arizona. To attract tourists and prospective real estate buyers to his new desert oasis, McCulloch made one of the most bizarre and famous purchases in corporate history. In 1968, he bought the actual London Bridge from the British government for nearly $2.5 million, had it dismantled, shipped through the Panama Canal, trucked into the Arizona desert, and meticulously rebuilt over a man-made channel. On the surface, this era represented the absolute peak of the McCulloch engine empire. The company was so rich from selling chainsaws and kart engines that it could literally buy a piece of European history and drop it in the American Southwest. Lake Havasu became the new center of gravity for McCulloch's ambitions. The company opened a massive new manufacturing and testing facility in the desert town, intending to eventually transition its operations away from the increasingly expensive, heavily populated aerospace corridor of Los Angeles. During these peak years, the McCulloch catalog was a sprawling testament to American two-stroke supremacy. If a machine needed a lightweight, high RPM gasoline engine, McCulloch built it. They produced outboard motors for the American boating market, attempting to challenge giants like Evinrude and Mercury Marine. They built portable arc welders powered by their internal combustion blocks. They continued to supply drone engines to the military. At the local hardware store, the yellow Mac 1010 chainsaws stacked the aisles, moving in massive volumes. The brand was a household name, but looking closely at the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Lake Havasu project was the exact moment the company lost its focus. Building a city in the desert required an immense diversion of capital, executive attention, and engineering resources. Robert McCulloch was fascinated by real estate, urban planning, and his J-2 gyroplane, a small aircraft he believed would soon fill the skies over his new city. Meanwhile, the engine itself, the foundation of the entire empire, was being neglected. A two-stroke chainsaw is an inherently violent machine. The same brutal vibration that made the MC-10 go-kart engine feel fast on an asphalt track was punishing on the hands, arms, and nerves of a logger or a farmer cutting firewood all day. While McCulloch executives were inaugurating the London Bridge and testing gyroplanes, European competitors like Steyr and Husqvarna were quietly and aggressively focusing on deep engine refinement. The Europeans were developing sophisticated anti-vibration mounts, systems of heavy rubber buffers and springs designed to isolate the shaking engine block from the handle. They were improving muffler designs to reduce operator fatigue. They were heavily investing in safety features, like the chain brake, which mechanically stops the spinning cutting chain in the event of a violent upward kickback. McCulloch saws were still incredibly powerful, but they were loud, heavy, and they shook violently in the operator's hands. The company's engineering culture, which had once revolutionized the timber industry by stripping away weight and adding massive RPM, had stalled. The Mac 1010 design, brilliant when it was introduced, remained largely unchanged for years. The company assumed that the American consumer's loyalty to the yellow block, the cheap replacement parts, and the massive dealer network would last forever. They had built an empire on raw, uncompromising, vibrating power. They believed the American market would always accept the noise, the smoke, and the physical toll of running a McCulloch, simply because the engine always started and always cut. The yellow engine seemed invincible, but the loud, unregulated strength of a high-revving two-stroke was about to collide with a world that no longer tolerated the noise. The first crack in the McCulloch empire did not happen in a boardroom or a bankruptcy court. It happened in the hands of American loggers in the Pacific Northwest during the late 1970s. For decades, professional timber crews had accepted that a powerful chainsaw was going to be loud, heavy, and physically punishing. But as European manufacturers like Steyr and Husqvarna began to aggressively expand into the American market, the standard for what a logger was willing to endure began to change. A professional operator holding a McCulloch Super Pro Series saw began to notice a profound physical difference when he picked up a European competitor. The McCulloch still had the raw, aggressive power that had built its reputation, but the Europeans had fundamentally changed the operator experience. The most critical difference was the anti-vibration system, a design that uses heavy rubber buffers or steel springs to physically isolate the shaking engine block from the handle assembly. Traditional McCulloch saws were built with rigid frames. The violent reciprocating mass of the piston and the high RPM vibration transferred directly from the magnesium block into the operator's hands and arms. For a homeowner cutting firewood on a Saturday, this was a minor annoyance. But for a professional logger running a saw 8 hours a day, constant vibration caused severe nerve fatigue and a painful condition known as white finger. The Europeans were also standardizing the chain brake, a mechanical safety device designed to instantly stop the spinning cutting chain in the event of a violent upward kickback. McCulloch engineers had built incredibly strong engines, but they were slow to adapt to these crucial ergonomic and safety refinements. They relied on their old formula, displacement, RPM, and the brand loyalty of the American hardware dealer. But that dealer trust, the exact service network that had built the company, began to fray. This was forced too at work. Dealers, fleets, farmers, and service networks. An outdoor power equipment dealer in Oregon or Washington could no longer convince a professional timber crew to buy a loud, heavily vibrating McCulloch when the European saws were smoother, quieter, and safer to operate. The professional market, which had always been the foundation of McCulloch's industrial pride, began to slip away. At the same time, the corporate structure behind the yellow engine blocks was undergoing a massive, irreversible shift. Robert Paxton McCulloch died in 1977, but he had already sold his engine empire. In 1973, McCulloch Motors Corporation was acquired by Black & Decker. This acquisition, a textbook example of Force 6, corporate consolidation and brand survival, was a profound culture clash. Black & Decker was an incredibly successful manufacturer of electric consumer tools and household appliances. They understood cheap plastics, high-volume retail, and the suburban consumer. They did not understand the violent, high RPM, oil-stained culture of the two-stroke internal combustion engine. Under Black & Decker's ownership, McCulloch's strategy was aggressively pushed down market. Instead of spending massive capital on research and development to win back the professional loggers, the new corporate ownership decided to extract value from the McCulloch name by flooding the American consumer market. The focus shifted away from heavy-duty magnesium chainsaws and toward cheap, entry-level string trimmers, lightweight leaf blowers, and inexpensive electric chainsaws. The manufacturing philosophy completely changed. The goal was no longer to build an engine that could be rebuilt in a machine shop 50 years later. The goal was to build a tool cheaply enough that a homeowner could buy it at a mass-market retail store, use it for a few seasons, and throw it away when it broke. The heavy die-cast magnesium blocks were increasingly replaced by injection-molded plastics. This shift devastated the brand's mechanical reputation. Inside American small engine repair shops, mechanics began to notice the difference. An old Mac 1010 from the 1960s was an investment. If it lost compression, a mechanic could tear it down, replace the piston rings, rebuild the carburetor, and send it back to work. The new cheap plastic saws of the 1980s were often not worth the labor cost to repair. When a plastic housing cracked or a cheap bearing failed, it was cheaper for the consumer to simply throw the entire machine in the trash and buy a new one. The two-stroke engine had transitioned from a durable piece of American iron into a disposable consumer commodity. To maintain profit margins on these cheaper tools, the manufacturing geography had to change. The cost of labor, casting, and environmental compliance in Southern California had become too high. The original sprawling Los Angeles factory, the facility that had birthed the kart racing craze and the American chainsaw revolution, was gradually shut down. Production was moved to Lake Havasu City and eventually to a new facility in Tucson, Arizona, with a significant portion of the parts manufacturing outsourced to Taiwan and Mexico. By the late 1980s, the company was still moving millions of units, but the soul of the engine empire was gone. The bright yellow machines on the shelves of big-box hardware stores still said McCulloch, but they were no longer the undisputed kings of the American forest. They were cheap, loud, disposable yard tools. The company had traded its professional engineering reputation for mass-market retail volume. But even that volume was about to hit an invisible, insurmountable wall, one built not by foreign competitors or electric tool companies, but by the federal government. By the early 1990s, the blue smoke that had defined American yard work was no longer viewed as the smell of weekend labor. It was viewed as a heavily regulated pollutant. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the California Air Resources Board, CARB, began targeting small off-road engines. This was Force 3, regulation, emissions, and certification. The problem was inherent to the core design of the engine that had built McCulloch. A traditional two-stroke engine completes its power cycle in just one revolution of the crankshaft. During a phase called scavenging, the moment when the incoming mixture of fresh air, fuel, and oil is used to push the burned exhaust gases out of the cylinder, both the intake and exhaust ports are open simultaneously. Because of this overlap, a significant percentage of raw, unburned fuel and oil slips directly past the piston and out the muffler. For 40 years, the American homeowner accepted this inefficiency. The engine was loud, it smoked, and it left a puddle of oil on the garage floor, but it always ran. Now, federal and state governments demanded a massive reduction in hydrocarbon emissions. For European manufacturers who had maintained their dominance in the high-margin professional logging market, this was a solvable engineering problem. Stihl and Husqvarna invested heavily in advanced cylinder porting, stratified charge combustion, and small catalytic converters, exhaust devices that use chemical reactions to burn off remaining hydrocarbons before they leave the muffler. But McCulloch was trapped in a financial corner of its own making. Under Black & Decker, and later under subsequent private ownership groups, the company had committed entirely to the bottom tier of the retail market. They were building cheap, injection-molded plastic saws designed to be sold by the pallet at emerging big-box home improvement stores. When a chainsaw retails for barely $100, the profit margins are razor-thin. McCulloch did not have the capital to re-engineer their entire engine lineup to meet the new EPA rules, nor could they pass the cost of expensive emissions technology onto a consumer who was only looking for a cheap, disposable tool. This price trap destroyed the last remnants of McCulloch's American service network. For decades, the independent outdoor power equipment dealer had been the backbone of the company. If a farmer's Mac 1010 broke, he took it to the local shop, where a mechanic pulled a rebuild kit from a parts bin, cleaned the carburetor, and put the machine back to work. But as McCulloch flooded the market with cheap, heavily regulated consumer saws, the independent dealers revolted. The new engines were incredibly difficult to tune under the strict emissions rules. Carburetors were sealed from the factory with tamper-proof screws to prevent owners from enriching the fuel mixture. When these cheap saws inevitably ran lean, overheated, and burned up their pistons, they were brought to local mechanics. Across America, small engine repair shops began refusing to work on them. The labor rate to tear down a plastic McCulloch engine was often higher than the cost of simply driving to a big box store and buying a brand new one. The replacement culture had arrived. The internal combustion engine, once a durable piece of American iron that commanded respect and regular maintenance, had been reduced to the status of a broken toaster. The professional timber market and the suburban homeowner were not the only domains McCulloch lost. On the American karting tracks, the legendary MC Series engines that had built grassroots racing were also being abandoned. By the 1980s and 1990s, racers were migrating away from the loud, vibrating McCulloch blocks. They turned to highly refined, liquid-cooled engines from Yamaha and specialized Italian manufacturers. The American two-stroke, which had once democratized speed, was suddenly too primitive and too temperamental to stay competitive. The kart shops that once proudly displayed yellow McCulloch blocks in their windows began stocking imported engines. Sensing the inevitable collapse of the traditional two-stroke consumer market, the corporate entity fractured. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, the McCulloch name was passed around like a liability. It was sold by Black & Decker to a private investor group, struggled with mounting debt, and eventually fell under the control of foreign holding companies. The company tried to pivot, pushing hard into cheap electric chainsaws and string trimmers to bypass the emissions rules entirely, but the brand's identity was irreparably confused. They were a company built on the deafening roar of a gasoline engine, trying to survive by selling quiet plastic appliances. The final geographic shift reflected this financial desperation. The massive integrated manufacturing lines of Los Angeles were a distant memory. Production had been moved to a facility in Tucson, Arizona, with a heavy reliance on components sourced from Mexico and Taiwan. But even with cheap labor and compromised materials, the company could not outrun its debt or the tightening federal regulations. In January 1999, the breaking point arrived. McCulloch Motors Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in a Tucson federal court. The remaining American factory went dark. Hundreds of assembly workers, machinists, and engineers were locked out of the facility. The physical infrastructure of the empire, the casting molds, the assembly lines, the parts inventories, was liquidated. The brand name itself was auctioned off to Feng, a Taiwanese manufacturing conglomerate, before eventually being sold again to the Husqvarna Group, the very European rival that had out-engineered them in the woods 30 years prior. The 1999 bankruptcy was not just the end of a corporate entity, it was the end of an era of American manufacturing where raw power was enough to sustain a business. The rules of the environment, the economics of retail, and the cost of labor had fundamentally changed. The engine still ran. The emission rules tightened. The margins collapsed. The mechanics walked away. The Tucson factory closed. The brand was auctioned off. The badge remained. The world it powered was gone. Today, the name McCulloch still technically exists. It survived the 1999 bankruptcy, passing through Taiwanese ownership before finally being absorbed by the Husqvarna Group, the exact European competitor that had systematically dismantled McCulloch's dominance in the professional logging market decades earlier. If you walk into a modern hardware store, you might see the McCulloch badge slapped on a quiet, emission-compliant, entry-level string trimmer or a battery-powered chainsaw. But the brand is just a ghost. The massive, integrated American manufacturing lines, the aggressive engineering culture, and the deafening two-stroke bark that define the company are entirely gone. The badge survived. The engine did not, but the original engines refused to disappear. In the corners of American preservation culture, the heavy yellow blocks are still running. Across the country, there is a dedicated, almost obsessive subculture of vintage go-kart racers. At classic karting events in the Midwest and Southern California, the pits do not sound like modern motorsport. They sound exactly like 1963. Racers scour eBay, swap meets, and old machine shops looking for surviving McCulloch MC10, MC49, and MC91 kart engines. They hunt for original pistons, carefully rebuild the diaphragm carburetors, and mix castor oil with high-octane racing fuel. When a grid of vintage McCulloch karts takes the green flag, it produces a high RPM, chaotic scream that modern, heavily restricted racing engines simply cannot replicate. The same preservation is happening in the woods and rural machine sheds. At vintage engine shows and logging festivals, collectors line up rows of restored McCulloch chainsaws. They fire up the massive two-man Model 549s from the late 1940s, the Super 33s, and the legendary Mac 1010s. The air fills with thick blue smoke, and the ground physically shakes. These restorers rely on oil-stained service manuals, digital collector forms, and bins of salvaged parts pulled from junkyards and farm auctions to keep the machines alive. This preservation passes the not nostalgia test. The mechanics restoring these machines are not just mourning the loss of a brand name. An old magnesium-bodied McCulloch Mac 1010 sitting on a workbench is a physical argument about a vanished era of American manufacturing. It represents a time when industrial power was designed to be repaired, not replaced. When a farmer bought a McCulloch in 1968, the service manual taught him how to tear down the cylinder, replace the piston rings, and tune the carburetor. It treated the owner as a mechanic. Today, a modern consumer tool is sealed in injection-molded plastic, governed by electronic software, and stamped with a warning label that reads, "No user serviceable parts inside." The old yellow chainsaw proves that American industry once built machines that outlived the economic models that created them. The physical footprint of the company, however, has been largely erased. The original Los Angeles factory on Century Boulevard, the sprawling industrial complex that perfected the high-pressure die casting of magnesium and birthed the American chainsaw revolution, has been swallowed by urban sprawl and the expansion of Los Angeles International Airport. The Tucson facility that witnessed the 1999 bankruptcy is no longer building screaming two-stroke engines. But there is one bizarre, permanent monument to the incredible wealth that the McCulloch engine empire generated. In the desert of Lake Havasu City, Arizona, the London Bridge still stands. It is a surreal footnote in American industrial history. A Midwestern engineer built a two-stroke engine so loud, so powerful, and so perfectly timed for the American market that it generated enough cash to buy a piece of British history, dismantle it, and rebuild it in the American Southwest. The bridge remains a major tourist attraction today. Most of the people driving across it have no idea it was paid for by the blue smoke of a million chainsaws. The fall of McCulloch was not a failure of mechanical strength. The engines were incredibly durable, capable of running at terrifying speeds and cutting through the hardest timber in North America. But an engine does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a system of environmental rules, labor costs, corporate priorities, and consumer habits. The world decided it could no longer tolerate the noise, the vibration, the emissions, and the physical toll of the unregulated two-stroke engine. America did not stop needing to cut down trees, clear brush, or race go-karts. It simply demanded that the power become quieter, cleaner, and ultimately disposable. Somewhere in an American garage, an old yellow McCulloch Mac 1010 still sits under a wooden workbench, the magnesium block scratched, the pull cord stiff, smelling faintly of old gas and oil, waiting for a weekend of heavy timber that will never sound the same again. See you in the next one.